Hey, what's up everyone? It's Timothy here with Jank Diver Gaming, and today we're going to be doing a mid-season update to the Unrestricted Cube. We're about halfway between Kaldheim and Strixhaven seasons, and we've got a number of adjustments we want to make before the next sets get here. The update's going to be a little on the hefty side for a quick fix with somewhere between 30 and 35 changes to the cube, but we're doing our best to balance out some of the color pairs and bolster those that aren't performing quite as well. As always, if you're interested in drafting the cube with us, you can join our Discord community using the link in the description below and subscribe to this channel for more content like this. Let's go ahead and jump into the changes. White will see two very similar changes, looking to increase the disruptive capabilities of aggressive white weenie decks. The first is Tithe Taker coming in over Nyx's Fleece Ram. Tithe Taker is not an all-star by any means, but it throws off the control players by a small margin and replaces itself with a small evasive creature when it dies, so it gives you some resilience to a sweeper. It's pretty easy to play around, of course, but it will annoy players holding counter spells or settle the wreckage in hand. These sorts of effects stack well together, so combining Tithe Taker's tax with Thalia's or Redain's tax effects can make it difficult for your opponent to deal with an early white weenie curve out. Nyx's Fleece Ram serves a specific role out of the sideboard against aggressive decks, but it really is more of a sideboard card than something you're looking to include in the main deck. In the same vein, we have Eidolon of Obstruction coming in over Ranger of Eos. Eidolon disrupts Planeswalker abilities and puts a small first striker on board. Again, it's not exceptional, but putting your opponent off of a pivotal Planeswalker for even one turn can make a pretty big difference in how your opponent's able to interact with you. Ranger of Eos was never embarrassing to play, but it was clunky and in a much lower weight class than the other 4-mana white creatures we have access to. It turns out that once you've reached turn 4, fetching up a couple of 1-drops isn't really an incredible way to pull ahead or stay ahead. We're hoping the combination of Eidolon, Tithe Taker, Thalia, and Redain can push white weenie decks ahead a bit by putting the more dominant late game decks behind a few turns. Unlike white, blue is receiving a much more substantial number of changes, starting off with 2 changes to our Planeswalker section. We're going to try out Jace Mirror Mage in place of Teferi Master of Time. I've gone on record many times claiming how weak 4-mana Teferi is as a walker that doesn't give you inherent card advantage and has a pretty weak protection ability. It can power through your deck and the design is cool, but it's weak, and I firmly stand by that opinion. Perhaps Kicker Jace isn't super powerful either, but it's definitely interesting, and it feels like a good replacement. Little Jace doesn't really protect itself, but it is a very real card advantage machine if you have control over the game. It's a cool design, there's some fun decision making that goes into playing the card, and Teferi's overstayed his welcome. Still hanging out in the Jace department, we're dropping Wielder of Mysteries for Unraveler of Secrets. 4-mana Jace has been respectable during his time in the cube, but he's fairly stale in terms of what he does. +1 draw a card is good, sure, but if that's all you've got going for you, you're probably not here to stay. The mill clauses are cute but unsupported bits of upside, and Jace does nothing to protect himself. 5-mana Jace obviously occupies a higher spot on the curve, but fills the same role as a +1 draw a card Planeswalker, with some card selection attached and a relevant minus that can unsummon creatures if need be. 5-mana Jace is a bit more expensive, but a bit more versatile, since you could conceivably play it in either control or tempo decks. Moving into the creature department, we're swapping Rattlechains in for Merfolk Trickster. Trickster's good, sometimes even great, but the double blue is a little problematic given the sheer number of double blue casting costs throughout the cube. Rattlechains is filling a similar role as a 2-drop that can push in some early damage for the blue-based tempo decks. We don't expect the spirit text to matter for the time being, but it might have some utility whenever we pick up Spell Queller on Arena. The other blue creature we're subbing in is Spark Double, taking the place of Dungeon Geists. Geists is in a strange place where it's not bad, but it's not the exceptional creature you'd think it would be if you've ever played with the card. It locks a creature down while beating down in the air, but there are so many value creatures in the cube that simply tapping a creature down doesn't necessarily take it offline. So many creatures have ETBs or persistent value on board, and a 3/3 is pretty frail, so Dungeon Geists falls short in most games. Spark Double gives us an additional clone, and a good one at that. Spark Double's unique feature is being able to copy a legendary creature or planeswalker, which most clones can't do. It'll be a nice tool to play around with for decks that want an additional copy of their best permanents, and it helps us remove yet another double blue card from the middle of the curve. Mystic Reflection didn't stick around too long, and that's okay given that we included it as a bit of a cute tech piece to see if something cool just happened to come of the card. That hasn't really been the case, so we're pulling it for a more general interaction piece, in this case Quench. Quench is pretty mediocre, truth be told, but it does the job it was designed to do, which is let the control and tempo decks interact cheaply, and occasionally nabbing your opponent's big expensive late game play. Callous Dismissal is taking the place of one of our newer additions as well, that is Depart the Realm, which is a reasonable, if unexciting, bounce spell with Foretell. We jammed a bunch of Foretell cards in when Kaldheim came out, thinking that Foretell cards played out better when there were more of them available, and while that's true, the powerful Foretell cards still play out just as well without the need for the second tier inclusions. Callous Dismissal is a mini exclusion mage in sorcery form, which matters for Finale of Promise decks, which are hurting for good sorceries worth flashing back. It's not the best bounce spell we have, but it's a good way to get a problem off the board, if only temporarily, while putting a small speed bump body on board at the same time. I think our community missed Commit to Memory, and we tend to like those people, so we're going to throw them a bone and bring it back in, pulling Stolen by the Fae once again to make room. Commit is a clunky piece of interaction with a clunky back half as well, but it plays well alongside other instants, and it can be an out to otherwise uncounterable threats like Niv Mizzet or 6-mana Chandra. Stolen by the Fae reads like it has a high ceiling, and it certainly does, but the ceiling requires for some very specific things to be happening to be achievable. There's some awkward finickiness to this card, like when you have to bounce a token and get no fairy tokens, and we're not fans of having an X spell that doesn't allow you to dump a bunch of mana into it for a more powerful effect. Sometimes it's spectacular, but Commit is more reliable and does have the degenerate combo potential with Narset, which people seem to like for some twisted reason. For our final blue swap, we'll be testing out See the Truth over Radical Idea. We just brought in Radical Idea recently and weren't really excited to do that, and we see some potential with See the Truth. You have to find roundabout ways to cast See the Truth to get your full 3 cards from it, but the Izzet decks can do it. Kefnet's copy ability achieves this, Finale of Promise and 3-mana Chandra can flash it back from the graveyard, and cards like Magmatic Channeler and Light Up the Stage give you outs to cast it from other zones as well. It's not good if you have to cast it straight up, but it's also not a disaster, and we felt good about planting a payoff for the Izzet decks that most other blue decks wouldn't be interested in poaching. Black didn't get much love with the Kaldheim update, but we've got some changes in mind, and Black's going to get the most changes with this quick fix, the first of which is Liliana, Waker of the Dead, coming in over Nightmare Shepard. With this swap, we should mention that one of our overarching goals with this quick fix was to rework Golgari as a color combination and give players more of an incentive to play green in their black decks, and vice versa. Golgari hasn't really been an exciting color pair, so we're leaning more heavily into black-green's latent graveyard synergies with this fix. 4-mana Lily can set up the graveyard while picking off a creature if the graveyard's already stocked. We thought this card would be better last time we included it, and were ultimately let down, but we think it's a good role player alongside some of the other changes we'll be making. Nightmare Shepard is a good card that just plays awkwardly in the color. Turns out you don't really want to be exiling your creatures from your graveyard in most black decks, as you want to recur many of black's creatures multiple times if you can, and Nightmare Shepard kind of shuts that plan off. This next one should be pretty quick. Eat to Extinction and Vraska's Contempt occupy the same play space, and we only want one of these expensive unconditional removal spells. We decided that the card filtering on Eat to Extinction served our purposes a bit more than the 2 life from Contempt, and we're going to swap these ones around for that reason. Graveyard Shenanigans is still the name of the game, so we're going to try out Timurit Calls the Dead over Phyrexian Arena. Again, you don't necessarily want to cannibalize your creatures from the graveyard, but Timuret's Saga does give you some board presence for doing so, and the third chapter can help you dig to more action. While it's a plant for green-black decks, the Saga should play fine in Aristocrat-style decks too, so it should have a bit more reach in our black section than Phyrexian Arena, which needs a bit more of a specific, controlling game plan to maximize its effectiveness. Next up, we're going to test out Drillbit over the Eldest Reborn. It's a good saga and a powerhouse in the peasant environment, but it's never felt exceptional in the more powered-up unrestricted environment, where creature versus creature interaction is less ubiquitous. Edictin and Telegraphed Discard are both easy to play around here, and we've never felt like the Eldest Reborn has been at its best. Drillbit's interesting. We have multiple Thoughtseize effects floating around, so the effect itself isn't unique, but the fact that you have to deal damage to the opponent in order to get the discounted rate means that many control decks won't be interested in Drillbit. Aggro decks want cheap discard too, but the discard effects we have are hotly contested, so Drillbit is being included as a discard effect that should fall into the hands of aggro decks that want it. Our Black Wrath section is going to look a little bit different after this update. Bantu's Last Reckoning is out for Finale of Eternity. Reckoning is about as unconditional as a sweeper is going to get, but the tap down clause is a colossal downside, as it gives the opponent ample time to recover after your sweeper during your turn off. Finale is less universal in its coverage, but should achieve much the same goal, albeit at a greater price. We didn't take the X equals 10 clause into consideration when discussing Finale. We just think it should be pretty easy to get your standard 3-for-1 off of it, in which case you'll be matching what you usually get out of your sweepers anyway. The other change to the black sweepers is Ritual of Soot coming in over Yahenni's Expertise. I advocated for keeping in Yahenni's Expertise for a while, and while I had high hopes for it, it's never been more than just fine. We're going to test Ritual of Soot as a dedicated sweeper for the early game. Ritual has a bit more coverage against some of the green decks that can drop sizable green creatures early in the game, which Yahenni's Expertise struggled to remove. We're still tinkering with the right configuration of sweepers in the cube, but we'll try out the Black Finale and Ritual of Soot to see how they perform. Next up, Dream Devourer caught our attention when Kaldheim released, but we ultimately decided against bringing it in. We've changed our mind at this point, and we're testing it out over Blackland's Paragon. Paragon did nothing wrong, but it's one of the more middling 2-drops in black, and felt like a card that decks won't miss during the draft. Devourer has the potential to be broken, providing a ramp effect to black decks looking to power out expensive late-game threats. It asks you to give up some tempo in the early game to give you a burst of mana in the late game. Being able to foretell a card like Liliana Dreadhorde General or Ugin the Spirit Dragon on turn 3 and casting them 2 full turns earlier than normal sounds impressive, and if that's the consistent play pattern with Dream Devourer, then you can sign us up. I've personally never been a fan of Command the Dreadhorde, since there are times that you can't even cast it, and if I'm including a big 6-mana finisher in my deck, I don't want to ever be in a position where it's a liability to cast my Game Ender. We're going to try out Agadeem's Awakening as an expensive mass reanimation spell for the black-based creature decks. As with the whole cycle of lands, we should get plenty of mileage out of the card given how easy it is to free roll it in black decks. Whether it gets cast often or not is a different question, but when it does, it should have a significant impact on the game. Burning Rune Demon feels like a good top-end creature to try out if we're going to intentionally bolster our Graveyard Matters decks. It's your standard giant flyer, which is always threatening, but it lets you set up your hand and graveyard a bit with its ETB effect. Your opponent gets to choose which card you get, but you can engineer situations where it's a benefit to you regardless of how your opponent determines to split up the cards. With reanimation effects at hand, you can just fetch up powerful creatures. Your opponent has to give you one, and the other hits the bin where you can just bring it back anyway. We trimmed Rise of the Dreadmarn, which on second read felt a little bit cute for what we're trying to do. Obviously, you can imagine scenarios where it's incredible and wins you the game, but it's just as easy to envision games where creatures just aren't dying and it's virtually dead. And to round out black, we've got a bit of a tech piece with Demonic Pact coming in over Hypnotic Specter. Demonic Pact is just a sweet value card that presents a bit of a mini game when you play it. Either win in your next 3 turns, find a way to remove your own pact, or lose. It's an interesting card that we think black aggro decks can try out, and has enough unique interactions with cards like Yorion or Turgid's Lantern that you can usually find a way to get it off board before you lose to it. Hypnotic Specter has been around perhaps a tad bit too long, since it's become obvious that it's neither exciting nor very powerful, and it's the black 3-drop we've been eyeing the longest as a card that should be removed. Poor red will only get one change here, but we did do a small overhaul of red in the previous update, so we'd like for those changes to marinate a little bit longer before evaluating this section. However, we landed on Soulseer as a powerful piece of interaction that will likely play out better than Fight with Fire in most cases. People love to live the dream with the kicker clause on Fight with Fire, but it comes up so infrequently that it's not a highly compelling reason to pick up the card. You want it because it deals 5 damage for 3 mana. Soulseer does the same at instant speed, with the upside of taking out the occasional indestructible creature as well. Soulseer also interacts with Planeswalkers, which Fight with Fire only does in its kicked form. We've got to make sure the number of instants and sorceries is somewhat balanced if we want to actively support Finale of Promise here, so it's always iffy to swap instants for sorceries and vice versa, but the ratio is in a healthy spot and this change felt like an upgrade to us. Green's got a few cards to discuss, with the first being Heroic Intervention over Snakeskin Veil. Yes, we're still waffling around with this spot, and we're not convinced at this point that we even need a dedicated spot in green for this type of effect, but it's clear that people aren't taking the one-shot effects like Snakeskin Veil, and Heroic Intervention does have a much higher ceiling, even though its usual case is being a worse version of the other single-target protection spells. We'll revisit this again at some point, and I wouldn't be shocked if we decide to altogether remove the green protection slot from the cube. We've been seeing some interesting token shenanigans happen in the Selesnya decks, so we wanted to give Esika's Chariot a whirl and see if the token duplication effect has some merit. It comes with its own little army at the very minimum, so it's never all that bad, and it's not limited to copying the cat tokens it produces, so there are some fun things that can happen with cards like Helm of the Host and such. Nath was the cut here, and you know I don't like this card because I don't even know the full name of the creature and couldn't be bothered to look it up. We've seen its abilities be relevant on occasion, but we've seen the low end of it more often, and it hasn't panned out as a desirable card for most green decks. Cavalier of Thorns is making a swift return to the cube as a green card that bolsters the Golgari graveyard decks. Ironically, we're ditching Jadelight Ranger to make room, so it's more of a graveyard enabler for a different enabler, but regardless, Cavalier felt like a good way to fuel the yard, and we struggled with finding a green 5-drop to cut. Seriously, the green 5-drop section is absurd, and we're going to have trouble with it down the line, but Cavalier deserved to come back in given our intentions with the green-black section. Finally, for green, I think people will be happy to hear that Vorinclex is making his Unrestricted Cube debut, taking the place of Sandworm Convergence. We were generally happy with Convergence. It was a ramp win con that couldn't be dealt with by conventional means, and it felt like a nice alternative for green decks to work around decks packing tons of removal. However, Convergence doesn't play well with other cards that care specifically about creatures, things like Shared Summons, Lead the Stampede, Fauna Shaman. So many of the green cards are built to interact with creature cards that Sandworm Convergence felt like a liability at times. People want to play with Vorinclex, and we can't really blame them. Some will see it as a green beater, and others as a combo piece with Planeswalkers, and it disrupts your opponent's sagas and Planeswalkers very effectively as well. It's clearly good enough, potentially even busted, and we'll give him a spin and see if he behaves himself. I suppose we can kick off the multicolor section with Golgari, since it's receiving a huge overhaul. Polokranos is here to stay, but the entire rest of the section is being changed. The first change is 6-mana Garruk coming in over Vraska Relic Seeker. In all honesty, the cards are very comparable, and cases can be made for either one being better than the other. We know Vraska's good, we've seen it in action enough to be confident about that, but we want to test Garruk as well and see how he plays out. There's a very real chance Vraska comes back, since her removal ability gives you better coverage over different permanent types, but Garruk's token generation is better, and he draws a card when he destroys a creature. I'm interested in what people think about these two, but again, this change isn't permanent, it's a flex slot to try out something new. Fiend Artisan is back as part of our attempt to bolster graveyard decks, and Seraph has been a big letdown, Turns out, Seraph doesn't grow as often as you'd expect, and you often have enough of your own cheap permanents on board that you don't even want to exile the board when you have the option. It's clearly not here to stay, and we'll give Fiend Artisan a second chance to impress us. Underrealm Lich is a card we haven't tried out yet, but it does what we're looking to do in this section, namely dig for action while filling up the graveyard. It's probably the best piece of the puzzle as far as how much self-mill it provides, and it protects itself well enough. It feels like a good fit alongside Fiend Artisan and Pulkranos, so let's see how it does. Fine Finality is actually an exceptional card, but it's basically Languish hanging out in the gold section, and we weren't huge on using a Golgari slot for a card that people often poached for their multicolor green decks. It'll be missed by some, but they'll have to look elsewhere for their sweepers. Golgari will also see Maelstrom Pulse taking the place of Assassin's Trophy. Trophy is versatile, but the downside is real, much more real than people give it credit for. You absolutely cannot use Assassin's Trophy early in the game without ramifications, and in the late game, Maelstrom Pulse has virtually the same amount of coverage. Pulse can also take out an army of tokens, which won't come up often but is a plus in its favor. We just weren't happy with Assassin's Trophy and feel like Pulse will make for a meaningful upgrade. Azorius is pretty light on good cards when it comes to the arena card pool, so finding something new to play with that wasn't miserable was a harder task than it sounds. We knew we wanted to remove 3-mana Dovin because, frankly, the card sucks, but we're not huge on any of the replacement options. We settled on Absorb because it will get played in Azorius control decks, but bear in mind that this is a filler slot. We have our eyes on Spell Queller as soon as that's made available, or if anything else new comes along, Absorb will most assuredly be the cut. We're still sticking with the Boros equipment deck for now. I've actually found it to be fun when the pieces come together. It's not a top tier deck perhaps, but it's been a nice experiment in trying out a more focused archetype for a less interesting color pair. That being said, we're still removing Nahiri in favor of Showdown of the Scalds. Nahiri signals the red-white equipment deck, but even in this dedicated archetype, we anticipate that Showdown is a better card, with Showdown also being effective in red-white aggro decks that don't care about equipment. It's been impressive in other formats, and it feels like a great fit here, so Nahiri got the axe before she had her time in the spotlight. Boros has a glut of 4-drops in a color pair that wants to be extremely aggressive, so we're shaving heroic reinforcements from the list, replacing it with Swiftblade Vindicator. Vindicator benefits from any and all Anthem effects and pump spells, while also wearing equipment about as well as any creature can, so it seemed worthwhile to try it out. Reinforcements is still good, no doubt, but curve considerations led us to cut it, and with Showdown of the Scalds coming in, we knew another 4-drop needed to be cut from this section. Simic will get Prime Speaker Vannifar over Rashmi Eternity's Crafter. Rashmi is a good card that people think is worse than it is. People assume when they trigger Rashmi and they blank on a big free expensive spell that Rashmi isn't quote-unquote doing its job, so to speak, and they overcorrect by thinking that it's not good because of that. Rashmi's still good when it whiffs, but regardless, we decided to try out Vannifar in its place. Vannifar plays in similar territory as Fiend Artisan and In Search of Greatness, and we'd be delighted to find out that all of those pieces can come together as a functional deck. Vannifar is probably not here for the long haul, but we'll see if the Birth and Pod type deck has merit in this cube. For Gruul, Waken the Trolls has felt either awkward or unnecessarily punishing, with not much of a middle ground. It preys on opponents having mana issues and leads to a very unfun experience in those games, and in well-balanced head-to-head games, it's pretty average. Pretty average isn't a ringing endorsement for the card, so it's out, and in its place we're going to try out Escape to the Wilds. It's an awesome ramp tool for Gruul decks, though we imagine the multicolor green decks will snipe it up when given the chance. We have no doubt that players will cast the card to good effect. We're just worried that we're planting a card in the Gruul section that the actual green-red decks won't be able to get their hands on. Our final multicolor change will come with Netherroy, Apex of Death, replacing Corvolt. After building a close-to-ideal Aristocrats deck for a rotisserie draft and playing 9 matches with a deck featuring Corvolt and a large supporting cast of sacrifice effects, I'm here to say that Corvolt just isn't a good fit for this cube. These decks need a lot of black mana, so casting Corvolt is already an issue, plus green provides very little to the Aristocrat-style decks. Sometimes Corvolt's a huge liability since you have to run him out into potential interaction, risking the option of sacrificing a land and setting yourself back significantly. He's being removed to try out Netherroy, who seems like a solid fit for our graveyard decks. Netherroy's a great card at just a 5 mana, 5/5 lifelink death touch, but he also rewards you for filling up the graveyard. He's one of our intended finishers for this style of deck, so we're excited to have him on board. Getting close to wrapping things up, we've got two quick changes to our colorless section, the first of which will see Cryptic Caves replacing Tyrite Sanctum. Sanctum's another one of those cards that reads well enough on paper, then during gameplay you just never really activate its abilities. You just tend to have enough to do with your mana during these games that a middling activated ability on a colorless land isn't really up to snuff. We've seen a surge in the number of monocolored decks that get drafted, so we're testing out Cryptic Caves as a nod to those players. And finally, we decided to bring in Aethersphere Harvester over Sigiled Sword of Valoron. We took an initial pass on Harvester because it felt like it counteracted aggro decks a bit too much at a time where aggro was struggling, but aggro's on the up and up, and the Harvester was an obvious good inclusion over one of our more unimpressive colorless cards. The Sigiled Sword just takes too much to get going and gets interacted with so easily that it's not a piece of equipment we're happy to be playing, forced archetype or not. Alright, that's a bit much for a quick fix, but we've been eager to make some changes since our big Kaldheim update. We will likely hold off on any more sweeping changes until Strixhaven comes out, so come join us for our mid-season update and try out some of the new cards. We're working on some things for the community in the background right now, so subscribe to this channel to stay tuned for new Jank Diver Gaming content, and if you're interested in joining our growing Discord community, there will be links in the description below. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. My name is Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming, and I'll catch you next time.